Hello and welcome to The Vaccine. I'm Sophie Scott. 2 outbreaks in 2 states caused concern this week as the federal government changes its advice on who should get the AstraZeneca vaccine. We'll speak to experts to find out how this will impact the rollout. Restrictions may have finally eased in Melbourne, but authorities there are closely monitoring a cluster at an apartment block at Southbank in the city. Meanwhile, the situation with community transmission of COVID in Sydney remains precarious. A man who was driving international flight crew contracted the virus. His wife and another woman tested positive, and now a 4th case has been identified today. New South Wales Premier Gladys Berejiklian says contact tracers are working hard to identify close contacts.
To be able to work out where the additional case and cases from yesterday actually crossed over within literally hours is just outstanding. And I think it shows the type of robustness in the system we have. It's far from perfect, no system is, but it is evolving. Let's go now to our reporter Danuta Kazaki in Sydney. What are the main concerns of the New South Wales health authorities, Danuta?
Well, the Chief Health Officer, Dr Kerry Chant, said today it was the fleeting nature of the contact that is the major concern. The case today was a man in his 50s from Bondi who was shopping in Myer in Bondi Junction, and it appears that it was very, very momentary, the contact between the two. CCTV footage has not shown the exact moment, but it does show they were on the same floor roughly at the same time. So authorities are investigating exactly how the man in his 50s contracted this virus.
And what restrictions has the New South Wales government brought in to combat this community transmission?
So we've got mandatory mask wearing on public transport for the next 5 days, and people are being urged to wear masks indoors. And it's one of those things that the Premier Gladys Berejiklian has said is proportionate. She's saying that people are sensible and that particularly people in the East have been there before and they know that they need to wear the masks indoors, especially when they can't socially distance. The other measures include the close contacts and the casual contacts. So at the moment, people are being told in Sydney's East to stay close. If they've been identified as a casual contact, that may be changed to a close contact. And so the Premier's asking people not to go away on holidays, but to stay close, just in case it changes in the next few days.
Thank you. There's been another major change to the vaccine rollout in Australia. The government's expert advisory group has now recommended people 59 and under get the Pfizer vaccine, not the AstraZeneca vaccine. Previously, the recommendation was for people under 50 to get Pfizer. There are reports that dozens of AstraZeneca vaccines are going to waste as clinics call off vaccination sessions and patients cancel bookings. And doctors say the changes are putting pressure on their practices.
What this means is increased uncertainty from our patients. They're often wondering what it means for them, but also uncertainty for our reception staff, our nurses and our GPs, because every time we talk to our patients, we are giving them the best information that we have to hand, and we're trying to do the right thing by them. But in this environment where we have changing science or evolving science, every day seems to bring a new challenge.
The federal government says it's expecting a drop-off in the number of people getting vaccinated in the coming weeks.
We will see a likely temporary reduction in daily vaccination rates as people make informed decisions around what they want to do in light of the ATAGI announcement. They then change their bookings and they then get access to a Pfizer provision point. But this potential reduction should be short-term, and then we would see a return to the more regular daily vaccination rates.
We'll speak to our expert panel shortly, but first let's get a breakdown of vaccine numbers from Casey Briggs.
Hi Sophie. Well, there's a bit over 3 million people in Australia aged between 50 and 59. These are the people this new advice now applies to, recommended to get the Pfizer jab rather than the AstraZeneca one. Of course, some of them have already had 1 or 2 doses of the AstraZeneca vaccine. Exactly how many, I can't tell you. That's because the federal government still isn't publishing any age information about people that are vaccinated. But the question is, how will this affect the pace at which this vaccine rollout goes in the coming weeks? 6.4 million doses have been administered so far. And if we look at the 7-day average to see the trend line a bit clearer, we actually have seen a little bit of a softening already in the last week, from about 120,000 doses a day a week ago to more like 103,000 at the moment. The biggest driver of that, though, is actually the Victorian surge in demand, particularly at their state-run clinics with the outbreak underway there. That has subsided a bit in the past week, even as we still record a dribble of cases coming out of Victoria in very small numbers, thankfully, and also thankfully almost all, or virtually all, linked back to known sources, or even better, in quarantine. And let's just briefly end in New South Wales, where, yes, we do have now a handful of cases being found, reminding us of just how fragile the COVID-0 position is to maintain in any jurisdiction in Australia. As authorities and the community work to stamp out these cases, the question then is, well, will we see, just like we saw in Victoria, a surging of demand at the New South Wales state-run vaccine clinics for people to get more and more vaccine doses?
Let's bring in epidemiologist Professor Mary Louise McLaws from the University of New South Wales and Cassandra Berry, Professor of Immunology at Murdoch University in Perth. Welcome. Professor McLaws, why did the expert committee make this recommendation?
Good evening, Sophie and Cassandra. TARGI, which is the Australian Technical Advisory Group on Immunisation, brought together information that has been stratified or looked at by age and gender. And we have been, I think, more fortunate in Australia than many other countries for our doctors being able to really well diagnose this really nasty side effect called thrombosis with thrombocytopenia syndrome. So it could be that they've identified more. The ATAGI have responded to this fairly rapidly and have said, we're not going to have any more people than necessary at any risk at all. So they've really increased the age at which you're allowed to have Pfizer to decrease that age-related risk of TTS, which is mostly in women and mostly in the mid-50s to lower age groups.
And Professor Berry, what should people do if they've already had their first dose of AstraZeneca? Should they get the second dose, and how can they feel safe to have that second dose?
Yes, well, people in their 50s who have already had their first dose of AstraZeneca are advised to patiently wait and continue with their booking for their second dose of AstraZeneca here in Australia. But I think we need to be adaptable here in Australia. The data is still coming out from other countries. And so as a population, we need to be able to take the changes and the advice that the government is telling us. The chances of this side effect with a blood clotting issue is 10 times less with the second dose than the first. So it is deemed safe.
We have had some vaccine hesitancy, Professor McLaws. What do you think this latest change might do to that vaccine hesitancy? Do you think it might make it worse?
Look, I'm not sure I like the term hesitance, because there's a group of people that will always be slower in making important life decisions. So I think they're more considerate. I wouldn't like to label them as hesitant, but those people that have real questions, have concerns, now should be very happy that the government has listened to these concerns, have looked at the data again, and feel very confident, given that the risk is greatest with the first dose of having that second dose safely. And as Cassandra mentioned, more data will come in eventually with what we call mix and match or prime and boost with AstraZeneca, followed with the second dose of Pfizer. But it's only at the moment at a preliminary analysis stage. So I imagine that ATAGI won't feel comfortable yet with making the decision that everybody should have the second dose of Pfizer instead of AstraZeneca. They have to look at things like a fever. You're more likely to have a fever, in fact, twice as likely if you have the second dose with Pfizer after you've had the first dose of AstraZeneca. What does that really mean? Is that important? Are there any other important safety issues, and how long does your antibody response to that different type of vaccine last. So they'll eventually make a decision about whether or not you should be keeping to that second dose of AstraZeneca. But I would advise everybody to have that second dose. I'll be having my second dose, and I feel very confident that that's the sensible thing to do. And maybe in the future we'll get a booster with a totally different type of vaccine. But Cassandra's the expert in that area.
Yes, so Professor Berry, on that, so the ultimate goal would be to have a more universal vaccine, wouldn't it, so that we wouldn't have to necessarily choose between one or the other and have these vaccines that may not be as effective for certain strains. Tell us a little bit about the idea of a universal vaccine.
Right, Sophie. So a universal vaccine is really like the holy grail in vaccinology. If we can train our immune system to respond to conserved regions of viruses that are shared amongst different variants and even those emerging viruses that are yet to appear on our planet, then we already have a good, strong baseline of immunity. So the strategy to design a vaccine that just trains our immune system to have eyes to see those shared components and to stimulate our memory B cells and our memory T cells is the great goal. We can achieve this with this heterologous prime boost regimen in vaccines. So this strategy has been around for 20, 30 years now. It's just hasn't been applied until now with this opportunity of the pandemic.
Well, let's hope that is something that comes along sooner rather than later. Just before we wrap up, I wanted to ask you, the US government's announced a big boost into new treatments for viruses. What sort of impact do you think it will make, and what are they trying to achieve, Professor Berry, by having this huge influx of funds to develop new antivirals?
Yeah, so developing antivirals is like a quick fix. Those people who are very early in their illness can be treated with these antivirals, and a better way is to take an oral pill rather than to have to be infused with an intravenous solution. So that will stop the virus from replicating. It usually attacks the virus in a number of points in its replication cycle so that it becomes so dysfunctional it can't replicate and copy its genome anymore. But we have to remember an antiviral is just an immediate quick fix, as I said. It's not a long-term solution. We still need to develop and distribute really effective vaccines for our own protection and our memory with that immunity.
And Professor McLaws, just wrapping up with you, I know one thing that you've said before is that you'd like to see younger people prioritised to get vaccinated. Just take us through why you think that's important.
What we have is the occasional breach from our quarantine program, and the group that it goes to are, of course, that group that carry most of the burden, the 20 to 39-year-olds, and they therefore are sadly, inadvertently, the group that then spread it. And so if you want most juice for your squeeze, as they say, that would be the group if you had a little vaccine available or limited, or that it was being staggered in its rollout, which it is, then that's the group that you would get most effect for stopping the spread of virus into the wider community, to prioritise them after, of course, the phase 1A of the essential workers. And it's very common. And I notice now that Norway is starting to consider that. But because they've got a very high level compared to us of circulating virus, they want to do a compassionate rollout for 1 week and then prioritise for the younger in another week. But I've been pushing for this rollout for the 20 to 39-year-olds for quite some time, because as an epidemiologist, I see where we would get most effect. And really, the Delta reminds us, I mean, it's now nearly 90% of all samples that are sequenced in the UK. And that happened very rapidly. And we really need to be always a step ahead of the virus. And the virus is very, very adaptive. And we need to be much cleverer and get one step ahead and protect the group that are going to catch it more commonly and transmit it.
Professor McLaws and Professor Berry, thank you so much for your time. That's the show for this week. Bye for now.